My son took out a life insurance policy on me and then tried to speed up the process. I found the documents under his bed, and a week later, I woke up to the smell of gas in my kitchen. That was the day I realized my boy wanted me dead. Not just gone, dead. Even now, months later, I can barely say those words aloud. They sit in my chest like wet cement, heavy, final, obscene. I raised him. I loved him. I gave him everything I had. And still, he looked at my life as something with a dollar amount attached, as something he could cash out early, like a bond he couldn't wait to mature. My name is Lillian. I'm 68 years old, and I live, or rather, lived, in a modest two-bedroom bungalow just outside of Tampa. I'd lived in that house since 1989. My husband, Gerald, passed 12 years ago after a long illness, and after that, it was just me and the house. And eventually, my son, Anthony, who moved back in for a little while after his second divorce. That little while turned into 3 years. At first, I welcomed him back with open arms. He was my only child. He came back broken, quiet, withdrawn, all of which I chalked up to the divorce. I cooked for him, cleaned up after him, even gave him the master bedroom when he complained that his old room made his back hurt. I was still working part-time at the library back then, and I told myself it was temporary, that he just needed some time to get back on his feet. But the truth is, Anthony never stood up again. He settled into that house like it was his by birthright. He stopped looking for jobs, started drinking in the evenings, started talking to me less and less. And when we did speak, it was often tense, not shouting, not explosive, but quietly charged. He'd make comments about how hard it is to take care of an old lady, or sigh loudly when I asked for help bringing in groceries. One night, when I mentioned that I was thinking of updating my will to include a few charitable donations, he went quiet for a full minute, then muttered, "Might want to think about your own family first." At the time, I brushed it off. But that moment stayed with me. It was months later, maybe 4 or 5, when I noticed his behavior start to change again. He became oddly attentive. He began making me tea in the evenings, insisted I relax more. He bought me new slippers, said I should stop climbing up to clean the top cabinets, that he'd take care of it. And once, while I was folding laundry, I heard him on the phone in the living room, whispering, too softly for me to catch all the words. But the phrase, beneficiary paperwork, drifted through the air like smoke. That's when the pit began to form in my stomach. I'd always kept important documents in a locked file box in my closet. Deeds, medical records, tax returns. But I never imagined I'd need to keep my life under lock and key. I trusted him. I raised him. And then, one morning, while he was out running one of his rare errands, I walked into his room to open a window. The air in there had grown musty, and saw a folder sticking out from under the bed. It wasn't hidden, not exactly, just casually tucked where he didn't expect anyone to look. I bent down, pulled it free, and opened it. What I found took my breath away. Inside were papers from an insurance company, a recently issued policy, with my name as the insured and his as the sole beneficiary. It had been signed only a few weeks earlier. The amount? $250,000. More than my house was worth. More than my life should have been worth to anyone who loved me. And the signature? Forged. I stared at the shaky attempt at my name. He'd tried to imitate my script, the wide loops, the clean tail of my L. But he got it wrong. Sloppy. Rushed. And at the bottom of the last page, in small print, in case of accidental death, payout is immediate. My legs gave out, and I sat on the edge of the bed, folder still open in my lap. My hands were shaking. I kept thinking, maybe there's an explanation. Maybe this is a mistake. Maybe someone convinced him to do this. Maybe he was just confused. But I knew better. And then, not even a full week later, I woke up to the smell of gas. It was 4:30 in the morning. I remember because I looked at the blinking red digits on my alarm clock as soon as I sat up, heart hammering in my chest. I thought at first it was in my head. A dream, maybe. But when I stepped into the hallway, it hit me full force. The acrid, sweet scent. The stove. The burners all turned on, no flame. The kitchen window cracked open. Anthony was in his room, door shut. I turned off the gas, opened every window, stepped outside, barefoot and shivering in the damp Florida air, and called my friend Nora, who lived 2 blocks away. "I think my son is trying to kill me," I said. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. She didn't question me. She came immediately. That day marked the end of pretending. I didn't confront Anthony. Not then. I needed to be careful. I needed to document. I took photographs of the stove, saved the insurance paperwork, began writing everything down. I met with a lawyer the next morning, an old friend of Gerald's, and showed him what I had. He didn't laugh. He didn't doubt. He looked me in the eye and said, "We're going to handle this quietly, but thoroughly." And from that moment on, I began planning, not just to survive, but to take my life and my house back. In the days that followed, I moved through my home like a stranger. Everything familiar had shifted, not visibly, but inwardly, like furniture in a dream. I noticed things I hadn't paid attention to before. The way Anthony watched me when he thought I wasn't looking, the little pauses in conversation when I mentioned anything about my health or my plans for the future. He'd grown too interested in how I slept, what I ate, how tired I seemed. And always, his hands lingered on doorknobs, on drawers. He was always checking something. I played the part. I smiled when he handed me tea, but I stopped drinking it. I waited until he left the room, then poured it down the sink. I pretended to nap in the afternoons, letting him think I was more fragile than I was. I began keeping my purse with me at all times, even around the house. At night, I slept with a small kitchen knife tucked between the mattress and the headboard. I didn't think he'd attack me outright. He wasn't that kind of man. But I no longer trusted the boundaries of what kind of man he was at all. When you birth someone, raise someone, feed and dress and read to someone, you never imagine fearing them. But I did. Quietly. Constantly. And yet, I never once thought of leaving. Not for a moment. Because this was my house. The lawyer, his name was Charles Harding, and he'd worked with Gerald when they were both younger men, laid out a plan. He listened to everything I told him, watched carefully as I showed him the insurance paperwork, the forged signature, the note from the insurance company that confirmed the policy was still active. He asked calm, practical questions, like how Anthony might have gotten my social security number and whether he'd ever handled my mail. He asked if I'd noticed anything unusual about the gas bill, or my bank account, or even my food. I had. Small things. A missing prescription refill. A jar of expired sleeping pills that had somehow found its way into the medicine cabinet. A bowl of soup that tasted faintly metallic one night, which I hadn't finished. Charles took notes and told me gently but firmly, "Lillian, you are in danger. You don't need to panic, but you do need to be deliberate." And so I was. We began documenting everything, not just through my written records, but with technology. Charles gave me a small audio recorder I could wear, clipped inside the neckline of my shirt. I wore it every day. I stopped confronting Anthony and started inviting him to talk. I asked questions. How are things with money? Do you worry about what'll happen to you if I die? I didn't press. I let him fill the space. He did, and what he said chilled me. One evening, while we sat on the patio and I sipped the wine he'd poured but hadn't touched, he said, "You know, if something ever happened to you, at least I'd be covered." I turned to him. "What do you mean?" He smirked. That smirk I'd started to hate. "I mean, you've always looked out for me. Even if you're gone, you'll still be taking care of me. How's that for motherly love?" He laughed. I didn't. I sent the recording to Charles that night. It wasn't a confession, but it was close. A few days later, Charles helped me file a formal fraud report with the insurance company, including the forged signature, the unauthorized policy, and a notarized statement confirming I had never applied for coverage or consented to it. That same week, he submitted an affidavit to the local authorities, not to press charges yet, but to have the incident on record. It was a chess move. Nothing sudden. Everything quiet, deliberate, traceable. Still, we needed more. The law is slow. It doesn't respond to feelings, only to facts. And until Anthony acted again, tried something else, I had to live in that house with him. So I made myself smaller, softer. I let him think he was winning. One night, I left my will out on the coffee table. A fake one, written with Charles's help. It named Nora as the sole heir, with clear stipulations that the house would be left to a local charity. I watched Anthony's face when he came in from a walk and saw the envelope marked Last Will and Testament just sitting there. He didn't say anything. He just stared at it, long and hard. Later that night, the tea he brought me tasted bitter. I spit it out discreetly and saved the cup. The next morning, Charles sent it to a private lab. A week later, the results came back. Trace amounts of diphenhydramine, a common antihistamine in low doses, but potentially dangerous in higher ones, especially when combined with other medications. My prescription heart medication, for example. That was the final piece we needed. Charles helped me draft an official complaint with law enforcement, attaching the audio recordings, the forged documents, the toxicology report from the tea sample, and sworn statements from both me and Nora, who had been documenting every time I'd confided in her. Within 3 days, a detective visited the house. Quietly, respectfully. He spoke with me while Anthony was out, confirmed the facts, and advised me not to confront him directly, but I didn't need to. The confrontation was coming, and it would be clean, legal, and devastating. The detective's visit was quiet, respectful, but it changed everything. After he left, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring out at the backyard, where Anthony had once played with his first dog, Jasper, a shaggy mutt with a crooked tail and the temperament of an old man. I remembered the way Anthony had cried when Jasper died, how he buried him beneath the bougainvillea bush and insisted on reading a poem he'd written himself. He was 11 then, sweet, gentle, still mine. I couldn't reconcile that boy with the man who now lived under my roof, the man who brought me tea laced with antihistamines and filled out insurance paperwork behind my back. I wanted to believe something had gone wrong in him, something broken, not born. But the truth was, I no longer knew where the line had been crossed. I only knew that it had. The next step came faster than I expected. The insurance company sent a formal letter within the week. The policy was cancelled. The fraud investigation opened. And, more importantly, a permanent mark placed on Anthony's name. According to Charles, this would follow him. He wouldn't be able to purchase another life insurance policy on anyone without scrutiny. And if the case escalated, and Charles was certain it would, he could face legal consequences far beyond a slap on the wrist. That was the moment I stopped feeling afraid. Not because he no longer frightened me. Fear doesn't evaporate like steam. It lingers in the walls, in the way you lock the bathroom door out of habit, in the way your heartbeat changes when you hear footsteps behind you, even in your own home. But something had shifted. I wasn't frozen anymore. I was ready. That night, Anthony came home late, smelling of alcohol and cheap cologne, which I recognized from a bottle that had sat untouched in Gerald's drawer for over a decade. He must have found it while snooping. He stumbled into the kitchen, muttered something about money being tight, and asked if I'd reconsider selling the house and splitting the proceeds. I looked at him, and for the first time in weeks, I let the truth touch my face. "No," I said, my voice calm. "This house isn't yours to sell, and soon it won't be yours to sleep in either." He blinked. "What does that mean?" "It means I've given you enough time, and enough kindness." The look in his eyes changed. The mask cracked, just slightly. But he was still arrogant, still sure I wouldn't act. He chuckled, poured himself a glass of water, and said, "Okay, Ma. You do what you need to do." And so I did. The next morning, Charles and I filed the paperwork. A formal eviction notice based on abuse and criminal misconduct, supported by written statements, documented evidence, and a recommendation from law enforcement. Because Anthony was not on the deed, and because I had never signed a lease or rental agreement with him, he had no legal claim to residency. This was my house. Always had been. Gerald and I had purchased it outright in 1993, and I had maintained it alone since his passing. Every bill, every repair, every coat of paint, mine. Anthony had contributed nothing but noise and mess. And now, finally, the law agreed. It would take a few weeks. That's how these things go. There's a process, a formal hearing, a judge's review, a date set for removal. But we had the timeline. We had the weight of the truth on our side. And while I waited, I prepared. I changed the locks on the exterior doors while Anthony was out one afternoon. I had spare keys cut and given to Nora and Charles only. I purchased a discreet security camera and installed it in the hallway outside my bedroom. Not because I expected violence, but because my nerves were frayed, and I needed to know I was not imagining things. Every click in the night, every creak of the floorboard, had become a question mark. Now, at least, I would have answers. The camera caught nothing at first. Just footage of Anthony watching television, opening the fridge, pacing. But one night, it caught something else. He stood outside my door for almost 7 minutes. Just stood there, silent, breathing. He never knocked, never spoke. But the sight of him, still and waiting, made my blood go cold. I saved the footage and sent it to Charles the next morning. "He's waiting for something," I wrote in the email. "I think he knows it's coming." Anthony grew restless in the days that followed. He started asking more questions, growing suspicious. "Are you hiding something? Why are you locking your door at night? Have you been talking to a lawyer?" I answered only once. I said, "I'm doing what any mother would do when her life is in danger." He narrowed his eyes, but said nothing more. A week later, the court date arrived. Charles and I sat in the small, sterile courtroom, all beige walls and humming fluorescent lights. Anthony walked in, wearing a suit he hadn't bothered to iron, his hair slicked back too severely, his eyes darting around the room like he was still looking for an exit. He tried to smile when he saw me. I didn't smile back. The judge, a tired-looking woman with a steady voice, reviewed the documents quietly. When Charles stood to present the case, he spoke simply, without flourish. He didn't dramatize. He didn't need to. The facts were ugly enough on their own. A forged signature, a fraudulent insurance policy, audio recordings of thinly veiled threats, and a toxicology report indicating an attempt to drug me under the guise of care. Anthony spoke too, or tried to. He stammered, blamed misunderstandings, claimed the tea was just sleepy time stuff, said the policy was just in case, to help with funeral costs. The judge asked him a single question. "Did your mother know about the policy?" He paused, then said, "Not really." That was enough. The eviction was approved. He was ordered to vacate the property within 5 days. Failure to do so would result in law enforcement removal and additional charges, pending a further investigation into fraud. When we left the courtroom, Anthony tried to speak to me. "Ma, come on," he said, his voice strained, almost breaking. "We can fix this. You're not really going to throw me out, are you?" I looked at him for a long time, then said, "You threw me out the moment you put a $sign on my death." And I walked away. The morning Anthony left the house for the last time was strangely quiet, as if the walls themselves were waiting to exhale. The sky outside was dull and grey, with heavy clouds sagging low over the rooftops, and the air felt too thick for a Florida spring. A kind of damp anticipation that clung to the skin like wet wool. I didn't sleep the night before. Instead, I sat in the living room long after midnight, listening to the old grandfather clock tick steadily through the darkness, measuring every hour he still remained under my roof. He packed hastily. Loud zippers, drawers slammed, a suitcase dragged across the hallway floor without care or consideration. He didn't speak to me directly, but I could hear him muttering under his breath from the other side of the house. At one point, I heard a crash. Something glass, maybe. And then silence. I didn't go to check. Whatever he broke could stay broken. He left just before noon. I watched through the sheer curtains as he loaded his bags into the trunk of his car, slamming the lid shut with unnecessary force, as if it might wound me. He looked up at the house once, as if waiting for me to appear in the doorway, to beg, to bargain. I didn't. I remained seated on the edge of the couch, hands folded in my lap, the only movement the slow rise and fall of my breath. And then he drove away. No goodbye. No apology. No last attempt at redemption. Just the low, bitter roar of his engine disappearing down the street. I didn't cry. I thought I might. I had imagined that moment for weeks, sometimes with dread, sometimes with grim satisfaction. But when it finally came, I felt only a dull, settling ache, like a fever breaking, like a wound closing from the inside. I was not triumphant. I was not relieved. I was simply empty in a way that felt clean, like the space left behind after a storm. I spent the rest of that day walking through the house, room by room, touching the things he had moved, the things he had tried to claim, the things he had left untouched. His scent still lingered faintly in the hallway, a mixture of cigarette smoke and artificial citrus from that cheap body spray he insisted on wearing. I opened all the windows and let the wind sweep through, cleansing every corner. In the bathroom, I found an empty bottle of sleeping pills pushed far back in the cabinet. Not mine, not a brand I had ever used. I placed it in a plastic bag and sealed it carefully before storing it in the locked file box Charles had given me. It didn't matter legally anymore. The case had already been filed, the investigation active. But it mattered to me. I wanted every trace of what he had done preserved somewhere, not out of spite, But because I needed to remember that I hadn't imagined it, that it had all truly happened, that I hadn't overreacted. Survivors do that sometimes. We question our own reality long after the danger has passed, especially when the harm came from someone who once called us Mom. The following day, Nora came over with a tin of cookies and a kind of bright, trembling concern in her eyes. She didn't ask for details. She had learned, over the years, how to give comfort without interrogation. But she did sit with me in the kitchen for over an hour, her hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, listening as I told her everything I hadn't yet said out loud. I told her about the tea, about the smell of gas, about the way he stood outside my bedroom door that night without knocking, breathing heavily, as if waiting for the courage to do something unforgivable. I told her about the forged documents, the way his voice changed when he talked about death, the way I had stopped recognizing the boy I had once rocked to sleep in my arms. She didn't interrupt. She didn't look away. And when I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand in both of hers. "You didn't lose a son," she said quietly. "You shed a danger." It was a brutal thing to hear, but it was also true. In the days that followed, I began reclaiming the space. I scrubbed the floors, not out of obligation, but as a kind of ritual, a physical act to match the emotional one. I opened the drawers he had used and reorganized them. I donated the old mattress he had slept on. I repainted the guest room walls, a soft, dusty blue that reminded me of the sea. For the first time in years, I walked barefoot through the house without fear. But freedom, I quickly learned, does not come all at once. It arrives in fragments, in glimmers. And so does grief. One afternoon, I found an old photograph of Anthony as a child, tucked behind the spice rack where it must have fallen years ago. In it, he was maybe 5 years old, holding up a homemade card that read, "Best Mom in the World," the letters uneven and smudged with fingerprints. His smile was enormous. His eyes were mine. I sat on the kitchen floor for a long time, the photo pressed to my chest, not crying, but holding myself very still. I wanted to feel that moment again, just for a second. I wanted to remember him as he had been before, time and resentment, and whatever rot had grown in him. But I couldn't. Not fully. The picture had blurred. Eventually, I placed the photo in a small box in the back of the closet. Not in anger, just in acceptance. I was no longer keeping it out of sight because I was ashamed, but because I was finished waiting for that little boy to come back. He was gone. And now, it was time for me to begin something that belonged only to me. It's a strange thing, living in a house that has just survived betrayal. The walls are the same. The floors don't creak any louder. The air flows in and out of the vents with the same steady rhythm it always did. But something changes in you, in the way your body responds to stillness, to silence, to the sound of your own breath in the early morning. There is a slowness to your steps, not from fear anymore, but from a deep, unfamiliar caution, the kind that makes you question whether peace is real or just a pause before something else goes wrong. For the first time in years, I found myself listening to the quiet without bracing for footsteps. The house became a place I had to learn to live in again. Every room held a residue, not physical, not even visible, but emotional. I would walk into the kitchen and remember the bitter taste of the tea I'd pretended to sip. I would open the linen closet and recall how I had once stood there, heart pounding, trying to find a place to hide that forged policy without shaking. Even the sound of the dishwasher at night, humming like a distant engine, could sometimes bring me back to those endless evenings when I lay in bed, listening for the sound of his hand on my door. I realized then that safety is not something you feel at first. It's something you notice in its absence. But little by little, safety began to show itself in small, surprising ways. It showed up in the way I opened my windows wide again, letting the breeze flow freely without wondering who might hear my phone calls or read my mail. It showed up in how I started playing the radio again in the mornings. Soft classical music, the kind Gerald used to love, and let it fill the space without fearing that Anthony would come in and tell me to turn that funeral music off. It showed up in the simple fact that I no longer checked behind me when I walked from room to room. And most surprisingly, it showed up in the dreams. They changed. For months, my sleep had been a battlefield. Foggy, fragmentary images of gas, of locks that wouldn't turn, of Anthony's face half-shadowed, always waiting for something. But now, the dreams became quieter, less vivid. One night, I dreamt of my mother's kitchen. Not the real one, but a stitched-together version from childhood memory, where everything smelled like cinnamon and wood polish, and no one was trying to take anything from anyone. I woke with the scent of cloves still lingering in my imagination. That morning, I baked for the first time in what felt like years. Banana bread. Simple. Familiar. I did it not because anyone was coming over, not to impress or distract, but because I wanted to fill the house with a warm, living smell. I wanted the oven on. I wanted my hands in flour and sugar, and I wanted to take something out of the heat that had survived it. That banana bread became, strangely, the start of something, a rhythm, a sense of days that were no longer defined by dread or defense. I began baking once or twice a week, small batches, nothing elaborate, and I started leaving extras on Nora's doorstep. She'd text me, sometimes with a heart or a thank you, sometimes with a short message like, "This one tastes like the kitchen I always wanted." I understood what she meant. It was around this time that I called Charles again. Not for legal help. That part was mostly done. The criminal case was still under investigation, and he was monitoring it quietly, sending me updates only when necessary. But that day, I called simply because I needed to hear the voice of someone who had helped me not just survive, but assert something I thought I'd lost entirely, my right to be safe in my own home. He answered on the second ring. "Lillian," he said, his tone warm, familiar. "I was just thinking of you." We talked for almost an hour. Not about Anthony, not about court dates or documentation, but about books. He told me about a novel he'd just finished. Something slow and lyrical, set in the Scottish Highlands, with more landscape description than plot. I told him I'd started rereading old cookbooks like they were literature, and he laughed. A deep, rich sound that reminded me that not all men were what my son had become. Before we hung up, he said something that stayed with me. "You know," he said, "some people rebuild by running. Others do it by staying still." I didn't say anything in response, but I felt something click into place inside me. That evening, I sat in the backyard with a notepad and a pencil, watching the sun slide down behind the neighbour's fence, and I began to write. Nothing formal, just thoughts, fragments, things I hadn't said aloud. I wrote about the smell of gas that morning, about the way my hand shook when I found the policy, about the exact, hollow sound Anthony's suitcase made when it bumped the front door on his way out. I wrote until the light was too dim to see the words clearly, and when I finished, I folded the pages carefully and placed them inside a small box in my bedroom drawer. That box became my archive, not of evidence, but of recovery. In the weeks that followed, I added more to it. A ribbon from a blouse I hadn't worn since the trial. a printed email from the insurance company confirming the cancellation of the fraudulent policy, a dried sprig of lavender. Nora had tucked into a loaf of bread she brought me on a Tuesday when the weather was too heavy for words. Each item in that box reminded me that I hadn't imagined it, that I had endured something real, and that I had not only come through it, but had remained. I didn't tell anyone about the box. It wasn't for the world. It wasn't even for Nora or Charles. It was for me. For the woman I had been when all I had was fear, and for the woman I was becoming now, who had learned to live without it. By mid-April, the days had grown longer, and the house no longer felt like a shelter built out of caution. It had begun to feel, slowly, tentatively, like a home again. There was still the occasional moment when the wind outside sounded too much like someone trying the front door handle, or when the creak of the floorboards overhead stirred a reflexive tension in my shoulders. But those moments were fewer now, and when they did come, they passed like small, familiar storms, acknowledged but no longer feared. The criminal investigation into Anthony's forged policy and suspected poisoning attempt remained open, but distant. Charles kept me updated sparingly, with an instinct I appreciated deeply. He understood that I didn't want to relive the facts every time a new piece of evidence was reviewed. He assured me the documentation we had submitted was enough to sustain a case, and the rest, whether charges would ultimately be filed, whether a judge would see it through, was no longer in my hands. It was a strange relief to have something out of my hands. I had carried so much for so long. And yet, with that freedom, came a question I hadn't expected to face so sharply. What now? I had lived in reaction for months, reacting to threat, to fear, to betrayal. Every day had been structured around protecting myself, proving something, surviving. But now that the danger had passed, and the evidence had been sealed, and the locks had been changed, I found myself staring into long hours with no clear purpose. I cleaned out closets. I rearranged furniture. I trimmed the hedges. I tried a new recipe each Sunday. But something remained unsettled, not broken, just adrift. Like a boat untied from the dock, gently rocking with no destination in mind. One afternoon, while reading by the window, I heard the sound of laughter outside. Not loud, not disruptive, but bright and sincere. I looked up to see the young woman who had recently moved into the house 2 doors down, crouching in her front yard with a small child and a watering can. She was pointing at something in the soil, and the child, a little girl with wild curls and scraped knees, was clapping in delight. I watched them for a moment longer than I meant to, then returned to my book, but the image stayed with me. That evening, I baked 2 loaves of zucchini bread and wrapped one carefully in parchment. I walked to their house, rang the bell, and introduced myself. Her name was Joanna. She was 32, a single mother, recently relocated after her divorce. The little girl was Sophie, age 5. Joanna looked surprised, pleasantly so, to see me. "I've been meaning to come by," she said, a bit breathless, a bit flustered. "But I wasn't sure if it was okay. You seemed private." I smiled. "I used to be. I'm not sure anymore." She invited me in for a moment, and though I declined politely, I promised to return another day. We stood on the porch a while longer, talking about the neighborhood, the best time to trim bougainvillea, the trash pickup schedule. It was nothing profound. But when I returned home, I realized my hands weren't shaking, and my breath had stayed steady through the whole exchange. That was how it started, not with a declaration, but with a loaf of bread and a child's laughter. In the weeks that followed, I allowed myself to venture out more often. I began taking morning walks again, down the same streets I had once hurried through with my head lowered, afraid of being recognized during the worst of it. Now I walked slowly. I paused to notice things. A bird's nest nestled in the eaves of the old schoolhouse, the way sunlight filtered through the branches of the jacaranda trees like lace. I stopped in at the local bookstore one afternoon and bought a blank journal with a blue linen cover, the kind of thing I used to give as gifts, but never kept for myself. I also returned to church. Not every Sunday, not yet, but enough to feel the rhythm of a familiar place, the steadiness of ritual. I didn't sit in the front pews, didn't join the potluck sign-up sheet. I just sat in the back, hands folded, listening. Once, during a sermon on forgiveness, the pastor said something that stayed with me longer than I expected. He said, "Forgiveness is not letting someone off the hook. It's letting yourself off the leash." I didn't know yet if I could forgive Anthony, but I understood what the pastor meant. One evening, I found myself writing about that line in the new journal. I wrote not about Anthony directly, but about the things I had given up during those months: my voice, my confidence, my sleep, my trust. And then, line by line, I wrote about what I had regained. It wasn't a triumphant list. There were no exclamation points, no declarations, just truths. I had regained my kitchen, my breath, my ability to walk barefoot in my own hallway. One night, I even left the bedroom door open again. Not wide, not recklessly, but just enough to feel the openness. It stayed that way through the night. Nora and I started meeting for coffee once a week. We sat on the patio of the cafe 2 blocks from the library where I used to work part-time. We didn't talk about the trial or the insurance anymore. We talked about books, about aging, about what it meant to choose yourself even after it seemed like no one else had. One morning, she looked at me over the rim of her mug and said, "You know, I was scared for you, truly, but I don't think I've ever seen you like this. You're real again?" I didn't know what she meant at first, but I carried her words with me all the way home, and they echoed that evening as I sat on the porch watching the sky melt into dusk. Yes, I thought. I was real again, not just surviving, not just defending, living. The rhythm of the days had settled into something resembling calm, not the ornamental kind they write about in glossy retirement brochures, but the kind built slowly, deliberately, out of honest silence and small choices. I was no longer counting time by distance from danger, but by nearness to something gentler. I had stopped looking over my shoulder. I had stopped expecting the sound of Anthony's key in the front door. What remained was a life stripped of illusion. Quieter, yes, but also clearer. And yet, even in that stillness, something within me remained unfinished. There are wounds that scab over neatly, and others that close with ragged seams, leaving tender tissue beneath. What Anthony had done, not just the insurance, not just the pills, but the total collapse of trust, had left a mark in a place that no court could reach. It wasn't about justice anymore. The legal system had already taken its course. The investigation was nearing its conclusion, with Charles keeping me informed only when I asked. No charges had been formally announced, but it didn't matter anymore. I wasn't waiting on a verdict. What I needed now was something the court couldn't give. I needed to understand who I was after surviving the kind of betrayal that doesn't just alter your view of someone else, but of yourself. For a long time, I had defined myself through the lens of motherhood. I had built my identity around it, as so many women of my generation were taught to do. Not as a conscious decision, but as an inherited expectation. I was Anthony's mother, long before I was Lillian again. I had given up promotions, vacations, friendships, and for a time even parts of my marriage to make sure he had what he needed. That wasn't martyrdom. That was motherhood, at least as I had known it. And then the child I had loved, fed, bathed, defended, forgiven, twice divorced, chronically impulsive, always falling but never hitting bottom, had looked at my life and seen a price tag. It wasn't just the betrayal of action, it was the betrayal of meaning. It was a long time before I could name that. One afternoon, I opened the box again, the archive I'd begun keeping in those first weeks after he left. Inside were the objects I had gathered not as evidence, but as artifacts. The torn receipt from the policy envelope, the photo I'd nearly thrown away, the dried lavender from Nora. I sat with them on the living room floor, each item laid out like pieces of a life I had lived and nearly lost. Then, for the first time, I added something new, a photograph of myself, just me. Taken that morning in the garden by Joanna, the young woman from down the street, who had come by with her daughter Sophie to bring me a basket of lemons from their tree. I hadn't known she was taking the picture. I was bent over slightly, tying back a branch, my face half lit by sun, my hair pulled back, sleeves rolled up, dirt on my hands, and smiling, not performing, not posing, just present. I placed the photo carefully at the top of the stack. It was a quiet declaration. I exist, even without him. That weekend, I agreed to speak at a small gathering at the community centre, a women's circle organised by the daughter of one of the book club members. The theme was rediscovery after loss. I didn't prepare a speech. I didn't bring notes. I simply stood in front of 20-something faces, some young, some old, some in between, and told them what it meant to wake up one day and realize that survival wasn't the end of the story, that surviving isn't the same as living, that peace isn't given, it's reclaimed. I didn't name Anthony. I didn't need to. What I said was this. I used to think that if someone you love turns on you, it means you failed, that you missed something, or gave too much, or weren't wise enough to see the signs. But I've come to believe something different. I think sometimes, when people choose harm, it's not because we failed. It's because we were available, because we loved openly, because we trusted. And that trust, once broken, teaches us not to stop trusting altogether, but to trust ourselves first. When I finished, no one clapped. Not because they weren't moved, but because it wasn't a performance. It was a moment. Something passed between us. Not pity, not sympathy, but a kind of mutual recognition. We had all been erased by someone once. Afterward, a woman maybe 10 years younger than me approached with tears in her eyes. She said her son had stolen from her for years, that she'd covered for him, lied to herself, lied to others, and now lived alone in a tiny apartment 2 towns over. She said, "I didn't think anyone else understood." And I told her, "We were never meant to carry shame for what someone else chose." That evening, when I returned home, I lit a single candle on the kitchen table and sat there, watching its flame sway gently in the silence. It was the kind of night I once would have spent with the curtains drawn, waiting for Anthony to come home drunk, ready to argue about bills or wills, or why the house still smelled like old wood. Now it was mine, my evening, my table, my stillness, and it was enough. By the time summer arrived in full, the heat settling over the neighborhood like a thick, unmoving blanket, I had begun to understand that healing wasn't something that would happen all at once, nor something that would ever arrive with fanfare or clarity. It was, instead, a quiet reconstitution of the self, a process so gradual and intimate but some days it passed unnoticed, like breath or heartbeat, and only revealed itself later in the ease of an unguarded moment or the softness of a thought no longer shaped by fear. I had fallen into new habits without meaning to, routines that were not survival mechanisms, but choices, the kind of choices I hadn't made in years. I began spending the early hours of the day sitting on the back porch, a cup of coffee in hand, listening not for danger, but for birdsong, for the rustle of leaves, for the slow unfurling of a day that belonged only to me. The garden, once neglected during the months I lived like a sentinel, had become a place of quiet reclamation. I weeded the flower beds slowly, with a kind of reverence, not for the flowers themselves, but for the woman who now bent over them with intention instead of distraction. More than once, I caught myself humming, not a tune I recognized, but something old and instinctive, a sound from deep within that returned only when I no longer felt watched. That small, unconscious gesture felt like a sign that I was, little by little, stepping back into the shape of a life not defined by suspicion or defense. Joanna and Sophie visited often now. The little girl had grown comfortable with me, no longer hiding behind her mother's legs or whispering in half-formed sentences. She asked me to tell her stories while she drew pictures on my porch, and sometimes she insisted I wear one of the handmade crowns she constructed from construction paper and glue. I wore them without hesitation. It felt like honoring something. It was during one of those visits, while Joanna and I sipped iced tea and watched Sophie chase a butterfly through the yard, that she asked me, very gently, if I had heard anything new about the case. I told her I hadn't asked Charles for updates in several weeks, and that I wasn't sure I wanted to anymore. The truth was, I had reached a place where I no longer felt that Anthony's punishment, or lack of it, would add anything meaningful to my life. What mattered was that I had told the truth, taken action, and drawn a line he could no longer cross. I had reclaimed what he tried to strip away, and in doing so, I had found the beginning of a life that no longer included him. Joanna nodded and said she understood. Then, after a pause, she asked if I had ever thought about moving, not as a suggestion, but as a curiosity. I knew what she meant. Some people, after trauma, need distance, a new place, a new view, a fresh start. But for me, the house no longer felt like a reminder of what had happened. It had changed shape again. It had been mine when Gerald was alive, when Anthony was a child, when it was filled with warm dinners and music and the ordinary friction of family life. And then, for a time, it had been a place of fear. But now it had returned to something else entirely. I told her, no, I think I'm meant to stay, not because I need to prove anything to anyone, and not because I'm too old to start over, but because I did start over, right here, room by room, breath by breath. She didn't say anything at first, but when she reached over and touched my hand, I felt a kind of respect pass between us. Not pity, not admiration, but mutual recognition of the work it takes to begin again when no one else is watching. Later that night, I returned to my writing. Not journaling exactly, but something else. Reflections, observations, the beginnings of something I couldn't yet name but felt drawn to put down. I wrote about the concept of safety and how it was less about locks and more about trust. I wrote about the body's memory, how long it takes to release the posture of defense. I wrote about what it meant to live in a house that had once been the scene of silent harm and had become, through deliberate daily acts, a sanctuary again. I also wrote a letter I never planned to send. It was to Anthony. Not for forgiveness, not for reconciliation, but for myself. I wrote it as clearly and honestly as I could, telling him what he had taken and what I had reclaimed, not because I thought he would understand. I no longer believed he could, but because the words needed to exist somewhere outside of my body. I sealed the letter and placed it in the same box as the photograph of myself in the garden. It belonged there, not because it defined me, but because it was evidence of the road I had walked. That week, I also began hosting something small at the house every other Sunday. Just 3 women from the neighborhood, all of them older, all of them in various stages of transition. One was recently widowed. Another had moved back to Florida after 30 years in Oregon to care for a sister with early onset dementia. The third had left her second husband at the age of 72. We sat in the living room, ate simple things, scones, fruit, whatever someone brought, and talked. We didn't have an agenda. We didn't speak in circles of therapy. We just allowed each other to be. And in that space, something beautiful began to take shape. Not recovery, but presence. No one asked about the things we had lost. Instead, we asked about what we were still learning to want. For me, the answer to that question was surprisingly simple. I wanted silence that didn't feel like a warning. I wanted mornings that didn't begin with vigilance. I wanted a life that required nothing more than my honest, whole participation. And, sitting among those women, their eyes wise, their stories unspoken but heavy with weight, I realized I had already begun to build that life, not somewhere far away, but right here, in the house where I had been almost erased, and where I had written myself back into the story. By late summer, the garden had become something of a second house, not in the literal sense, but in the way that it now held the parts of me I hadn't known how to express anywhere else. I found that I was most myself out there, hands in the dirt, sleeves pushed to the elbows, sweat at the temples, listening to the world as it murmured in leaves and branches and wind. There was no need for language in the garden. No one asked me to explain. And that, after months of having to justify my fear, prove my sanity, and re-establish my right to safety, was a kind of grace I had not expected. I planted late that year, too late, some said, but the soil didn't seem to mind. I chose what I wanted without thinking too hard. Rosemary, marigolds, snap peas, and zinnias. Not for show, not for any grand harvest, just for the doing of it. There was something deeply restorative in the quiet repetition of weeding, watering, watching. When I pulled carrots from the earth, I felt like I was lifting a part of myself out too. Something buried, something stubborn, something still alive. It was during one of those garden afternoons that I received the final update from Charles. The case against Anthony had been closed. No charges would be filed. The district attorney, he explained gently, had found the evidence concerning but inconclusive. The forged signature had been enough for the insurance policy to be voided, yes, but the toxicology report, without direct witness or confession, was not prosecutable beyond reasonable doubt. It wasn't enough for a criminal case. Charles told me this carefully, his voice measured, his tone cautious. He asked if I was disappointed. I surprised both of us when I said no. Because the truth was, I didn't need Anthony punished to believe myself. I didn't need a courtroom to confirm what I already knew in my bones. I had walked through fear and come out whole. I had protected myself. I had chosen to live, not in hiding, but in fullness. There was, I realized, a power in walking away from justice without bitterness. Not because justice didn't matter, but because I no longer required it to feel complete. Still, that night, I sat in the garden long after the sun had gone down, letting the air cool around me, listening to the sounds of crickets and the distant hush of passing cars. I thought about the last time I'd seen Anthony, his face sullen, confused, still wrapped in the assumption that the world owed him something. I wondered if he ever thought about what he'd done, if he still believed I had overreacted, if he remembered standing outside my bedroom door that night, not knocking, just waiting. I no longer hoped for remorse. I no longer imagined reconciliation. What I felt, sitting there under the stars, was something far stranger, far more human, a kind of mourning not for him, but for the mother I had once been, the one who had believed she could fix anything with time, with love, with faith. That mother was gone. And in her place was someone wiser, someone who no longer believed that loyalty should be blind, someone who understood that blood does not sanctify betrayal, and that love is not a contract of permanent forgiveness. As autumn approached, I began making changes inside the house. Not renovations, not anything visible from the street, but quiet gestures of ownership. I cleared out the last of Anthony's boxes, even the ones I had told myself I might sort through later. I opened them one by one, gently but without hesitation, and let go of what didn't belong anymore. A broken lamp, faded receipts, a sweatshirt I had once washed and folded and left on his bed. I didn't save much. Just a few childhood drawings, which I slid into the back of a drawer, not out of sentimentality, but out of a kind of archival respect. The rest I donated or discarded. And when the last box was gone, I sat on the edge of the bed and exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in finality. One evening, Ruth, one of the women from our Sunday gatherings, stayed behind after the others had left. She had a way of asking questions without words, of looking directly at you with the sort of stillness that made you tell the truth before you realized you were doing it. We sat in the living room, the remains of lemon tea, cooling on the table, and she said, "Do you think you'll ever see him again?" I paused before answering, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to answer it honestly, without the armor I had learned to wear. "I don't think I need to," I said. "And that's what matters more than anything." She nodded once, then looked around the room, at the soft lighting, the freshly laundered curtains, the books stacked neatly beside the armchair. "This place," she said, "feels like it's finally yours again." It was such a simple observation, and yet it struck something deep. Yes, it was mine again. Not in the way it had been when Gerald was alive, not in the way it had been when Anthony was small and barefoot and still called me Mama, but in a new way, a quiet, deliberate way, the way something becomes yours, not because you inherited it or bought it or were born into it, but because you stayed when you could have fled, and you reclaimed it 1 hour, one breath, one choice at a time. As the light faded that night, I opened the windows and let the cool air move through the house. I stood at the threshold of the front room, hand resting lightly against the doorframe, and I let myself remember, not as punishment, but as proof. There had been danger here. There had been betrayal. But there had also been resistance. And in the end, there had been return. The last truly warm day of the year arrived without announcement. There was no sudden heat wave, no grand shimmer of light through the windows, only a stillness in the trees, a softness in the shadows, and the peculiar sense that the air had decided, just for a little while longer, to remain gentle. I spent the morning sweeping the porch, not because it needed sweeping, but because I had grown to love the slow rhythm of it, the sound of the bristles on wood, the light scrape of leaves moving aside, the meditative motion of hands doing something simple and complete. There was no more fear in that house, not even memory dressed up as caution. I had expected, perhaps, that even after everything was over, after Anthony had left, after the case had closed, after the doors had been locked and the cameras packed away, that some part of me would remain on alert, that my body would still brace for footsteps, or wake in the night, half listening for danger. But instead, there had been peace. Not the dramatic kind people chase through retreats and therapies, but the ordinary kind that arrives when you are no longer performing your own survival. That peace did not mean I forgot. It did not mean that Anthony's betrayal no longer hurt. I would never pretend to have risen above it completely. But the pain had changed shape. It was no longer the sharp stab of disbelief or the dull throb of humiliation. It had become something quieter, a weight I had learned to carry without letting it tilt me off balance. I had stopped trying to make sense of why he did what he did. There is a kind of exhaustion in trying to build a map through someone else's cruelty, in trying to understand the route they took to reach the place where your life became expendable. Eventually, I understood that I would never find the root of it. Maybe he was bitter. Maybe he was broken. Maybe he simply saw the world through a lens that turned people into assets. But none of those reasons changed what had happened. And none of them could undo what I had done in response. Because I had not collapsed. I had not handed him the house. I had not surrendered my breath, or my name, or the story of who I was. I had stood up, slowly and then completely, and I had said, no. And that no had saved my life. There were no grand conclusions, no sweeping closures, just the small, practical shape of healing that made itself known in the quietest of moments, in the way I now opened the curtains every morning without checking the street first, in the ease with which I left the front door unlocked while I watered the garden, in the laughter I allowed myself when Nora teased me about the way I always added too much cinnamon to everything I baked. In early November, Joanna invited me to attend her daughter's kindergarten performance, a small, cheerful affair held in the multi-purpose room of the local elementary school. I went, sitting among parents and grandparents, surrounded by the rustle of programs and the scent of floor wax and crayons. I watched Sophie stand up with her class and sing a song about the seasons, her voice off-key but unself-conscious, her eyes searching the crowd until they found mine. Afterward, Joanna introduced me to one of the teachers as a very dear neighbor, and I realized that, without planning to, I had become part of someone else's story again. Not as a victim, not as a figure of sympathy, but simply as a woman who was present. That night, I walked home alone beneath a sky so clear it felt like glass. The stars were sharp above the rooftops, and the air carried the promise of coming cold. I pulled my sweater closer, but I didn't hurry. For once, the darkness didn't feel like something to flee. It felt like something to walk through with steady steps. At home, the house welcomed me the way a house should, with its quiet walls, its warm floors, its memory not of trauma, but of restoration. I made tea and sat by the window, watching the neighborhood grow still. In the silence, I allowed myself to think of Anthony, not with rage, not with regret, but with clarity. He had made a choice, and so had I. He had decided to see me as a number on a policy. I had decided to see myself as more than what he left behind. I did not need justice through the court to reclaim my life. I did not need an apology to prove that I was worthy of safety. What I needed, and what I had given myself, was permission. Permission to name what was done. Permission to act. Permission to rebuild without explanation or apology. Weeks later, I stood in front of the closet where I had once hidden evidence, recorded audio, stored documents in trembling hands. That closet had been the center of my fear. the place I guarded, the place I checked nightly, the place I returned to again and again, just to feel like I still had control over the story. Now, it was just a closet. I opened it and placed inside the sealed box, the one with the photos, the letter, the final pieces of that chapter. Not as a burial, but as a shelving of something complete. I didn't tape the lid. I didn't label it. I simply set it down and closed the door. In the months that followed, I continued to write. Not about Anthony, not about the betrayal, but about women who lived through silence, about endurance that made no noise, about what it means to start again after your name has been spoken like a weapon by someone who once said it with love. I started sending small essays to local publications. A few were published, quietly, humbly, with modest bylines and kind responses from strangers. It was enough. And when the first frost came, covering the edges of the garden in silver, I stood at the window with my tea, watching the light gather behind the trees, and I understood something I hadn't been able to name until that moment. This was not just survival. This was return. Not to what I was before, but to something more honest, more whole, more deliberate. A woman not defined by what she'd escaped, but by what she had chosen to keep. Her mind, her breath, her home, her name, and above all else, herself.